Hi, this is Hatim Kheir with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and this is the update for Day 19 of the Public Order Emergency Commission hearings. Today was a short day despite hearing from 3 witnesses. We heard from Superintendent Dana Early of the OPP, Paul Leschede, who is a protester involved with the Windsor protest at the Ambassador Bridge, and Marco Van Huigenbos, who was a protester involved with the Coutts protest. I'm going to come back to some of the highlights from Superintendent Early's testimony. First, I'll just briefly talk about the 2 protesters we heard from today. Some of the highlights that we heard from Mr. Leshede's testimony was that he described what he experienced was a peaceful protest, though, admittedly, he did only attend the protests for a few hours in the evenings on the weekdays, and then didn't attend into the weekend because he said that in his mind it became apparent that things were building up to a police operation and that the protest would be cleared. He did explain that he reached out to Pat King to ask if there was any connection between the Ottawa protest and the Windsor protest, and he said that the answer he received was, quote, categorical no, end quote. Something to note is that Mr. Leshede described that he was one of the people whose accounts were frozen. He said that he found that his account was frozen on February 18th. Moving on to Mr. Van Huigenbos, he is a local politician in Coutts. He became involved with the protest there, and he said that just given his background, he was one of the people who were better positioned to enter into a kind of spokesman role, and that's what he did. He explained that he was involved in negotiations with the RCMP. In his view, he described it as having a good working relationship. Something to note, there was a moment he described where there was a face-off of sorts between protesters and the RCMP. He explained that the protesters formed a line and began to sing "O Canada," and that after that the RCMP backed off, and in his view there was a shift at that moment from more of an enforcement approach by the RCMP to one emphasizing negotiation, at least for that time being. So that's the 2 protesters. I do want to talk about some highlights from Superintendent Early's testimony. So she was superintendent of the West region, which she explained extends all the way down to Windsor. And in this, with relation to the specific protests, she undertook a role as the incident commander. So basically, she was in charge of the operations there. And some highlights that are relevant to the use of the Emergencies Act are that she said by the end of February 12th, she was confident that Windsor tow trucks would be sufficient to clear the remaining vehicles, and so they wouldn't need additional tow trucks. That's important because one of the powers that was granted under the Emergencies Act was the ability to compel tow truck drivers, which the Government of Canada would have to argue was necessary in order to justify the invocation of the Act. She also explained that the criminal code was used to create the exclusion zone that ultimately cleared the protesters. I highlighted that note that an exclusion zone was created, and so again, now hearing from a witness for the Ontario Provincial Police that the criminal code was used to do that, and that was done before the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which just goes to show that that was another emergency power that could have been handled otherwise. And there was an interesting moment when Superintendent Early was cross-examined by Alan Honor, who's counsel for the Democracy Fund. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms shares standing with the Democracy Fund and Citizens for Freedom. And Mr. Honor put a document to Superintendent Early, which was a readout of a conversation between Premier Ford and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And of note, in that conversation, Prime Minister Trudeau says that, in his view, no further legal tools should be needed because the protesters had broken other laws, and so those laws should just be enforced. And that was on February 10th. So that again goes to the idea that there were legal mechanisms available, thus making the invocation of the Emergencies Act unnecessary. And from plenty of the cross-examinations done by my colleague Rob Kittredge, we've heard from several police officers that the invocation, or that the emergency powers were helpful but not necessary. So that's a recurring theme that we're hearing across the evidence. So that's the recap for today. At the end of the day, we did hear from Commissioner Rouleau that we should expect tomorrow to be a long day. So we can look forward to that. Thanks, and I'll talk to you then.